Donna has authored a book titled How Women and Children Helped Win World War II. She specializes in speaking on home front history of Evansville during World War II. So if you would, let's give Ms. Bone a nice round of applause.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. As you mentioned, one of my specialties is the home front in World War II from the tri-state area. I was looking at your exhibit over there of the 45 caliber bullets. Everybody familiar with this exhibit? Mm-hmm. I noticed, do you notice something else about this bullet that isn't common with bullets? The shell casing. What's the normal material that a shell casing is made out of? Brass. Well, in World War II, brass became in short supply, and Chrysler was told they had to find something else to put on these bullets. And within a couple of weeks, their scientists came up with a formula for steel that was as close to brass as they could come, and that's what you see on the casings of those two bullets in there. Those are not brass bullets, those are metal bullets. All right, so I'm not here to talk about bullets or Chrysler today. I'm here to talk about the Women's Army service pilots of World War II. So this is a true story of patriotism, positive attitudes, and you'll see why as you hear me talk about some of the things they had to put up with as females and as pilots. Their love of flying and their willingness to serve no matter the cost. It didn't matter. They whatever you asked of them, they were willing to do it. Now, before we got into the war, Eleanor Roosevelt, England was a little bit ahead of us in terms of using female pilots as part of their military. Of course, that may have been number one because they were in the war earlier, and number two because their population is not as extensive as the pool of pilots would have been in the United States. But they did have pilots that were part of their military in England. And when she found out about that, she said that the American women were weapons waiting to be used as part of the military, and she was right, because they were a great asset, and they proved to be a secret weapon, basically. So 1,078 American women flew U.S. Army aircraft in World War II. They were called the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, and they were one of the best kept secrets. There was actually a couple of other names that they were called before they were called this, but we'll get to that when we get into their history. As early as 1930, the possibility of using females as pilots was floated from the War Department to the Army Air Corps. Now, this is what I find interesting. Remember, the War Department recommends to the Air Corps. Air Corps says, no way in heck. These women are utterly unfeasible, too high-strung for wartime flying. Of course, that was the common perception of women in general at the time. 10 years later, now remember, it was the Army Air Corps that said no way. 10 years later, they're proposing the use of 100 women as pilots, as co-pilots, in transporting single-engine planes, ferrying these planes. But General Hap Arnold, who was chief of the Corps, turned it down. Of course, that was all before Pearl Harbor. So Pearl Harbor happens, and now the United States is at war. In January of 1942, 343 civilian male pilots were assigned to the domestic wing flying planes within the United States. Of course, that doesn't mention the hundreds and hundreds of male pilots that went to Europe and Asia to fly as part of this war. And because of that, the supply of experienced pilots started to dwindle. So the need develops again. And thus begins the story of two women that were a key player in the WASP movement. The first one is Nancy Harkness Love, the other one is Jackie Cochran. So we're going to start with Nancy Love. She got her pilot's license at the age of 16. Now there were quite a few, probably maybe at least 100 experienced female pilots in the United States at this time. Most famous one, of course, was Amelia Earhart. When war breaks out in Europe in 1940, she proposed the use, and this goes back to the other slide where it said the Air Corps had a proposal and turned it down. And one of the reasons the Commander General turned it down was because of a promise that he made to Jackie Cochran, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, Nancy's husband, Robert, was called to duty as a deputy chief of staff for the Ferrying Command in 1942. So she went with him to Washington, D.C., and also got a job in the ferrying division. Now, her husband worked with Colonel William Tuner, who was the head of the Air Transport Command. And when he got to talking when her husband got to talking with Tuner, he told Tuner that his wife was an experienced pilot and that she had made this proposal. The proposal was turned down. Well, Tuner was very interested, and they met. She sat down and she talked with him, and she explained the proposal and what she thought was feasible, and he accepted the proposal. So she adopted, or she had 28 pilots that she knew who were experienced pilots. And they started what was at the time known as the Women's Army Ferry Squadron, or WAFS, and they were known as the originals, as they would recruit the rest of the pilots after this group. This group would always be known as the originals. And each woman was required at the time to have over 500 hours of flying experience, and many of these women had much more than that. Now, the recommendation that they be commissioned as part of the military was actually denied, so they were considered to be civilians. And the plan was that they would only fly single-engine light planes, but they proved as time went on that they could fly anything that the military could throw at them. Now, that first group of 28 experienced pilots was sent to Delaware for training. Even though they were experienced pilots, they had to be trained in the military way. Because they were civilians, they had to pay for their transportation, their housing, and their food, which I find extremely ridiculous. When you think of it, they're being brought in essentially as contractors, so they should have paid for their training. They were put in tiny rooms with windows that had no curtains, so if they wanted to change clothes, they had to turn the lights out, or they had to go into the hallway to change clothes. This is just the start of a lot of the harassment that these women put up with throughout their tenure as pilots. The male pilots were not required to have inspections, but for some bizarre reason, the female pilots had their quarters inspected once a month. Now, let's talk about Jackie Cochran. She was an experienced pilot, earned her pilot's license in the 30s like Nancy Love did, and set a new women's world record in 1937. No other pilot, male or female, held more speed, distance, or altitude records in aviation history than Jackie Cochran. She volunteered for the Royal Air Force because they were taking female pilots. In fact, some of the pilots that ended up in the WASPS started out flying for England because they weren't taking female pilots at the time here in the United States. But before she left, she apparently was, I don't know if they were friends or close acquaintances or whatever, but she made General Hap Arnold promise that he would do nothing with female pilots unless he brought her in to help. And when she was over there flying for England, she found out about the WAFS that Nancy Love was doing, and so she came back to the United States, talks to General Arnold, and convinces him to create another group of female flyers called the Women's Flying Training Detachment, the WFTD. Now, Cochran's goal was to have women with limited experience and to train them, little to no experience to train them. So now you have two programs. You have one with Nancy Love using experienced pilots, and then you have another one with Jackie Cochran with pilots who are going to need a lot of training. Now, at some point, General Arnold decides that the two programs needed to be combined, that they didn't need two separate programs. So that's when they brought them together and called them the Women's Army Service Pilots. They're still considered at this point to be civilians. Now, here's the problem. As I mentioned, Nancy Love's goal was to take advantage of the experienced female pilots to do whatever the military needed, whereas Jackie Cochran basically is in it to further her own ambitions by becoming the head of a military corps of female pilots, and she actually perceived Nancy Love as a threat. Cochran felt that pilots should be used for jobs that male pilots didn't want, and her behavior, her flamboyant behavior, embellishment of her importance tended to turn a lot of people off. And, does it say? No, that's the next slide. I guess it's coming up at some point. But basically, Jackie Cochran was put in charge of this program, and Nancy Love was made executive director of the ferrying part of the job. And the original 28 reported directly to her. As an entire group, the original 28 were not happy with the fact that Nancy Love was not put in charge and that Jackie Cochran was. Now, the next group of pilots, there was probably a mixture of ladies here who had some pilot training. Many of them probably had no pilot training before this. Eventually, 25,000 women would sign up, but only 1,078 successfully were eventually accepted and then completed training. Now, there were no barracks in Houston, which is where this next round of ladies was trained. No barracks. They weren't allowed to use the airfield dining room. Their training started so early that they couldn't walk to town to get breakfast. The bathrooms were off limits and they had to walk a half a mile to use the restroom. Does that sound familiar? You might see the movie Hidden Figures. Same thing. As civilians, they didn't receive uniforms, but they were given leftover overalls from the male civilian pilots. And they joked that the sizes were large, larger, and basically largest. So they were much too big for these women. You could see the one woman on the left over there trying one on. Some of the women actually bought their own overalls to wear. Now, you're in Houston, Texas, and it comes with it its own share of problems. In one point, locusts showed up. They also had to deal with scorpions, snakes, and dust. Now, eventually the training was moved to Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas, which is about 40 miles west of Abilene, out in the middle of nowhere. This would become the permanent home for the Women's Army Service pilots. Now, interestingly enough, there was a rash of sudden emergency landings from the male pilots who just basically wanted to check out the females who were being trained at the time. Now, in spite of the fact that these are adult women, 20 and older for the most part, some of them were married with children, they had to have chaperones. And they were told to dress nicely and modestly whenever they left the base. They were referred to, or the field was referred to as Cochran's Convent because of this. They had their own mascot. It was called Fifinella. And it was based on a creature that was a part of a children's book written by Roald Dahl, a Tinkerbell-like creature, and the book was called The Gremlins. And the figure was drawn by Walt Disney. This figure can be seen on the jackets of WASPS and current female pilots in the Air Force today. Now, each class had a designation. The first two letters is the year they were trained. The second, the W, of course, is the fact that they were women. And the third is the class. In this case, it was the third class of women in 1944. Now, after they went through the flying, and oh, by the way, before I forget, here's another story. There was for the final test, there's this checkoff. And there's a guy with a checkoff list observing them flying and all this kind of stuff. Now, he would ask some of them to go out with him. If they turned him down, he would flunk them on the flying test. And the military got wind of this and changed it so that there were 2 people checking them off for their final flights. Now, eventually, one of the groups of ladies was sent to Camp Davis in North Carolina, where they suffered further harassment in the form of male mechanics who refused to work for powder puff pilots. And at this time, they were restricted to Piper Cubs, very small single-engine planes. They were also required to have monthly physicals because the male physicians said that women's menstrual cycles had a negative effect on their physical and their emotional state. This was the thinking at the time. No job was too tough for these women. This is an example of the types of things that they did as WASPs. Delivery of new planes, and that's where Evansville comes in, and we'll talk about that in a minute. As target and glider towing, which was used to deliver supplies. As flight instructors, in fact, and I'll mention this a little bit later, a couple of these women were actually flight instructors at Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked. Air taxi service, flying bigwig military folks around the country. Enemy training maneuvers, which wasn't always a good thing, even though the bullets and whatever it was they were using were blanks. It could still be pretty dangerous if you were playing the enemy in these maneuvers. And believe it or not, for top secret experiments, they were actually experimenting with drones back in World War II, and some of the women were part of that experiment. They had a perfect delivery rate. Now here's an example of one time there were 20 PT-17 open cockpit Stearman planes. We've got a Stearman, by the way, in the Evansville Wartime Museum. How many of you actually been to the museum? Okay, it's that yellow plane that was actually used to train P-47 pilots. 6 of the 20 pilots on this particular mission were females. The female pilots landed first. 2 days later, there were still 12 planes that hadn't shown up. Turns out these guys took side trips to visit their families and their girlfriends before they showed up to Tennessee. They proved that they could fly anything that the military would let them fly. 4 of these female pilots set a flying record on PT-19s of 2,500 miles in 4 days. Now, B-17s are huge bomber planes and were considered tough by some men until some of the WASPs were trained secretly and proved they could fly them. Male pilots were reluctant to fly the B-26s, which is another huge bomber plane, because of the high accident rate at this plane. Now, 4 of the female WASPs flew 2 B-26s over a base in Alabama, where hundreds of men were training, and when the 4 men climbed out of the cockpit, the men decided, well, maybe it wasn't that difficult to learn how to fly this plane after all. Only 100 male pilots knew how to fly the Super Fortress. 2 women were trained to fly them and were eventually grounded so as not to embarrass the male pilots. Now, WASP and the P-47, of course, P-47, many of them made here in Evansville. The headquarters for Republic was in Farmingdale, New York. Almost 15,000 of these planes are produced. 6,242 were made here in Evansville. And it was the job of the ferry pilots to fly them out of Evansville to the coast or wherever it is they were being shipped out. Evansville was a very routine stop on the path for these WASPs, who would bring planes in to the modification center, and then they would take P-47s out to be delivered. This particular photo is of Teresa James, one of the originals, experienced originals, getting ready to take off on the inaugural flight of the 10,000th Thunderbolt that was produced in September of 1944.
Was that one made in Evansville or Farmingdale?
I don't think it was made in Evansville. Now, is everybody familiar with the modification center that was here at the airport? Okay, this was separate from Republic, although they worked closely together. This is where planes were customized. So it could be that maybe the stickers on the cockpit were in a different language because a different country was going to be flying it, or a different type of climate, arid versus desert versus Arctic versus jungle, whatever. They would be customized at the modification center in Evansville. So these pilots would fly planes in for the modification center to upgrade them or change them, and then they would go over to Republic and then fly P-47s out to the coast. Now, there were casualties with the WASPs. 38 women died flying for the Army Air Force. Their fellow WASPs actually accompanied their bodies to tell the family what happened. The military would not pay for the burial or anything, so the women would actually pool their money to make a donation so that they could have a proper burial for the most part. They weren't even given a flag because they weren't considered part of the military. It is also believed that some of these deaths were the result of sabotage. The program actually ended at the end of 1944, even though a little bit earlier than that, once again, they tried to get them to be commissioned by passing a bill through Congress, but it was rejected, 188 to 169. Even though over 300,000 other women were part of the military as nurses, wax waves, whatever. The WASP program was eventually disbanded in December of 1944. They had flown over 12,000 missions, over 9 million miles in operation. And it wasn't for another 30 years before the military would accept women as pilots in the Air Force. Most of these women, once they left the WASP, went home, married, had children, settled in, raised, lived their lives. Some of them stayed in aviation and worked as training instructors. Many of them didn't talk about their service as WASP because the military sealed their files and they felt that nobody would believe them. Now let's talk about some of these pilots. I mentioned Nancy Harkness Love. She was born in 1914. She died of cancer at the age of 62 in 1976. She became a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force Reserve in 1948. Both her and her husband received awards. He got the Distinguished Service Award. She got the Air Medal for her operational leadership as part of the WASP. Jackie Cochran died 4 years later. She joined the Air Force Reserve also in 1948 as a lieutenant colonel and was promoted to colonel in 1969. She received 3 Distinguished Flying Crosses. She was the first woman to break the sound barrier in 1953. She sponsored Mercury 13, the Women Astronaut Program, and was 74 when she passed. Here are a few of the originals. The first one recruited was Barbara Erickson. B.J. Erickson is what she was called. Born in 1920. She died in 2013 at the age of 93. She was the first woman recruited by the Civil Air Patrol in 1940. She was a commander within the WASP and was qualified to fly all pursuit planes. At one point, she flew 4 2,000-mile trips in 5 days, and I don't think she was warned ahead of time that she would be flying that many miles over those days, and she didn't bring enough clothes with her. And so at night, she would have to wash her clothes out in the sink and let them dry, and then use the same uniform the next day. Here's a picture of BJ in front of Republic Aviation here in Evansville. This photo would end up in the local newspaper here. She was the first woman to fly a P-47 out of Evansville. She had flown a Mustang into the airport for modification at the modification center. And the operations officer at Republic said, "Have you been checked out on a P-47?" And she said,